Okay, we are live for another episode of the Unplanned show. And with me today is Sriram Subramanian from Microsoft. Hello, Sriram. Say hello.
Hey, Dormain, thank you. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, wonderful to have you here. Now, I'm also going to just kind of quickly before we dive in, today we're going to be talking about um, uh, responsible generative AI. And so this is I think just a really interesting hot topic. But before we get too far into it, I just want to cover for folks what we have coming up here on the Unplanned show. Mondays, 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. Today we've got Sriram. Next week we had James Urquhart, but he has reached out to reschedule, so he's TBD. So stand by. Still working on kind of an updated guest for next week. But then after that, July 24th, we'll have Heath Newburn on talking about defining AI ops. There's a couple different definitions floating around out there. So going to pick Heath's brain on that. And then July 31st, we're going to have Heather Hinton, PagerDuty Zone Chief Information Security Officer. And she and I were having a conversation about this maybe provocatively titled "The Death of the Single Security Class." And so, you got to put like the death of this or something in there, and then it gets a lot more exciting. So tune in for each of those, either on PagerDuty's Twitch channel, or we're going to be starting to broadcast straight from PagerDuty's LinkedIn page. So let me go ahead, pull this down of our upcoming shows. And I'm going to kind of bring things back over to Sriram and why he's here today. I had the pleasure of hearing him give a talk at GlueCon at the end of May on the topic of responsible generative AI. And, just found it really insightful. I was taking all kinds of notes. And, obviously there's a lot of chatter in the industry and in the marketplace right now on the topic. And something that I've noticed is like when you say responsible generative AI, there's sort of two branches. You can kind of go down like sort of the ethical question. And actually, I was just Mark Andreessen published this sort of this kind of
Yes.
seminal piece about a month ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you haven't checked that out, why AI will save the world.
Correct.
The great place to kind of explore, I think, a lot of the ethical and legal side of that question. But then there's also the practical side of responsible generative AI. And so, I'd love to start there, Sriram, and sort of ask how you kind of got started sort of thinking about this and sort of developing that sort of the sort of set of opinions that you shared, and maybe even how those have changed in the last, gosh, it's been almost 6 weeks now. So fast moving space. Just, how did this kind of get started for you?
Absolutely, Dormain. But before that, thank you. I want to thank you for giving me a chance here. And the lineup of speaker that you have is fantastic. I can't wait to hear on what the other speakers are talking about, AI ops and security, and whatever James has got to talk about. But that's awesome. And hello, everybody, wherever you're tuning from. Thank you for joining me here. So, Domain, so you kind of touched upon two things, like two branches or two parts of the ethics aspect of responsible AI and the practical aspects of dealing with it, right? And before I go into that, let me give you, and you also asked about how I got started here, right? So, in terms of my job, I'm a principal program manager within Microsoft within the Azure Reliability, Azure Customer Experience organization. Previously, I was the domain lead for data and AI within Fast Track for Azure, which is when I got to play a lot with the OpenAI, with Azure OpenAI getting released and whatnot. However, the responsible AI aspect has been always been a radar, right? Like we have seen, we were even before the generative AI kicked in. There was always a question about is the predictions that the models are making, are they fair, are they unbiased, are they explainable, and all those things were coming along, and as an industry we're getting better at that, right? um, with generative AI, with the potential and with the capabilities like manifold, the responsible AI aspects are only like they are like vastly exaggerated or they vastly increased, right? The concerns are high with the power of generative AI that puts in your hands. So that's where I'm sitting in, and then I'm as an observer and as someone as playing with OpenAI, Azure OpenAI services, with someone who's interested in responsible AI. So I started. This is a good opportunity to talk about what I've learned and what industry is observing and what others can pick it up, given everything is lining up and given the momentum around generative AI, right? And that was the context of the Glucon chat, Glucon talk, which you alluded to. Where do you want me to go in now? I set the context, and do you want me to go into the ethics aspect or the practicality aspects of that?
Well, I mean, I think maybe a good starting point is, let's just where someone's kind of getting started with generative AI, right? They're looking at how they're going to bring this into their organization. Those
Got it.
they have to answer all those questions, but like at that point, like what are some of those questions that they should be answering, and maybe what are some of the if you want to begin as you mean to go on,
Sure. Yeah.
sort
Got
of
it.
starting points.
But and then I mean, we've been using this word. Let's also set the context on what generative AI essentially mean. That right, like essentially we're talking about the capability to create content, whether it's text, chat, code, or images through APIs. That's what and then we won't talk about what is powering them. Shortly, like just LLMs or large language models or foundational models, however they're called. But the generative AI itself, like informally, if you want to think about that, the ability to create content through a simple API call, that's what generative AI essentially means, right? And the idea behind that is like the algorithm behind it, like deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning, which is again forms under the huge umbrella of artificial intelligence. Given that focus here, we won't go more on that one, but let's just get started with that as the context. Some of the challenges that we see, right? Like if you want to think about it, it's either since it's all about content generation, it could be like harmful content being generated, or it could be inaccurate information, right? And then there's also this security and privacy concerns. Those are the three large buckets that, if you want to think about, if you want to see, like, if you're thinking about using generative AI in your organization, these are the potential challenges that are ahead of you, right? And when it comes to harmful content, right, it could be bias, it could be hate, it could be like inappropriate content. It could be content that could incite violence. It could incite self-harm. This kind of content, given that LLM is just like spews out uh, the content generated, you need to watch out for these things, right? Is the content generated being unbiased? Is it like how do you protect that? Is it going to possibly incite violence? It's going to stereotype a bias? Those kind of things that you should think about. The other bucket is like it could completely inaccurate, right? The analogy I made in the talk, and the analogy I think is like LLMs are like a high schooler or a teenager who's like, if they don't know the content, they have every audacity and every courage to write something with utmost confidence as if they are factual, right? That's a very much possibility with LLMs, with generative AI, right? It could be ungrounded, it could be like irrelevant, it could be incoherent, blatantly like inaccurate information, but all packaged as if like they look like accurate, right? We have cases of incorrect citations, we have cases of puzzles being solved wrong, math being done wrong, all those things. Those two are, you should watch out for. If you are an application developer, or if your organization is depending on generative AI, the content generated by generative AI, watch out for these things, right? It is possible the content generated could fall under these two buckets. And then there is this evergreen concerns of security and privacy, right? What is my data being used? Is my data being used for is like Uber training? Is it safe? What are LLMs doing with my data? How do I bring in my data? How do I make sense out of uh, you know um, with my industry, my company, my enterprises data, right? And we have the concerns of IP violations. The interesting note, just today, like OpenAI, the company OpenAI is being sued by Sarah Silverman because like they found out that OpenAI is at least like they think that OpenAI has used their content as one of the training data points, even though they have specifically not allowed using their content to be used for training purposes. So and we have seen at least like handful of cases again, not just OpenAI but in general, generative AI, LLMs and foundational model in general around copyright violation, all few interesting cases of who's owning the code and all those things. So that's kind of a very high level overview of what are you looking at, what is the possibility that could go wrong if you are thinking about generative AI, if you are thinking about either developing applications using generative AI APIs, or you're thinking about consuming generative AI capabilities to make your decisions.
Yeah.
That's
And I really like how you framed and kind of simplified the definition of generative AI is like you're creating content like through an API, right? On the other side of that API are your large language models and deep learning and like, it's worth understanding and that it raises an interesting question for me, which is, all of these sort of the big three, right? Harmful content, inaccurate content, and security and privacy. Are those things that you are solvable inside that large language model and the whole the training architecture around it? Or is this really something that we need to think about kind of surrounding, or adjacent in order to have that kind of checks and balances control outside of the AI that's generating the content? There's just almost another system, if you will, that's helping with all of those aspects. Just because even thinking about humans, right? You made the example, kind of the analogy in terms of the inaccuracy problem of this is like your teenagers, right? Wildly overly confident in what
exactly. Yes.
and so it's just part of their development, and some people grow out of it, some people don't. And same thing with plagiarism. Like humans have violated the issue of plagiarism. It's not always something you can solve inside of human intelligence.
Correct.
So why should we expect to be able to solve this in a kind of an artificial intelligence? Do we need to account for it in some other way?
Great question. I will give you. I'll set a little bit context around how the industry is approaching this, and provide a little bit more Microsoft specific standpoints. Right. As you can see, you witnessed, there were like lots of talks around from all major cloud providers had a talk around responsible generative AI with their own viewpoints and their own perspectives, right? However, it is right. It's all let's take Microsoft's core or responsible AI principles, right? They're making sure the six tenets are like fairness, transparency, accountability, inclusiveness, privacy and security, reliability and safety, right? The principles are centered around these six tenets. And if you want to think about how do I enforce these things, you need to have at least like there are multiple ways of doing that, but one of the prescribed ways, the way that Microsoft recommends is like having the governance in place, having the rules like to standardize. How do you enforce governance, right? Then you need to have training and best practices in place, and finally you need to have the right tools and processes to enforce all these things, right? You have to fundamentally like have governance, have rules on top of governance, have right trainings in place, and have right tools and processes, right? But that's just in general responsible AI principles that Microsoft's recommended approaches. Each industry, each company has its own, and they're all converging on our own in different. They will all converge on these things in their own unique ways. But ultimately, like what is important is like how is fairness ensured, how is transparency ensured, how are the models accountable, privacy and security, reliability, and all those things, right? And inclusivity. Now, uh, with having said that, I see like two things happening, and they are like kind of think like parallel developments, right? As an industry, we are getting better at how do we handle this. Right? This is where the practicality comes into picture, right? Like assuming that LLMs don't do anything more, which is not the case. every LLM, every foundational model is inherently improving the responsible AI practices. It's getting better. They're trying to overcome bias. They're trying to trying to be more explainable and all those things. That's happening in on one lane, one track, I would say. And then the other track is like, how do you put this in place, right? This is where, like, some interesting nuances, like, few companies might make it more invisible, in the sense that as an end user or as an application developer, we should not have to do that. The provider will put necessary checks and balances in place, so that assess not the LLM itself, but the framework built around LLM, or the tools and services built around LLM, bring in this responsible AI capabilities, right? That's basically like think like developer empathy, or use a customer empathy, right? Which is great. But I personally think that just like how the industry handles security, is still handling security, the providers will make, will keep on strengthening the core services, and will bring in tools and services on top. But it's ultimately, it's going to be a shared responsibility, right? An application developer or an end consumer should also do their part of ensuring security, right? Ensuring privacy, ensuring whatever. If you're thinking about using applications, follow best practices. If you're developing applications, enforce right develop in the right way, put right security paradigms, like that, right? That's what I see happening as well. This is what I pitched in the talk, like things like a shared development, a shared responsibility model, right? There are certain things that LLMs can put in. They can make the LLMs themselves better, or they can put layers on top of that, like where, like, you can have content moderation, for example, right? But at the end of the day, at the presentation layer, the developer can still make it, like, for example, make sure that the default response is safer response rather than incorrect response, right? If you are a shopping cart developer, application developer, if the question comes up to a chat that, like, what do I ask for my, some medical diagnosis, you could choose to respond safely, right? Have a message saying that I'm a shopping cart, I can't answer about your health concerns, talk to your provider. If it's emergency, call 911. Things like that you can put in place. So think like it's like two tracks of the railroad, both are happening. Eventually they'll converge, right? Like, at least from our viewpoint, they may not converge in reality, but they look like the railroads converging, right? That's how I see it happening. The providers will strengthen the LLMs and foundation models and the services on top of that progressively. But as an application developer who's building applications on top of generative AI APIs, or as an end user who's using or consuming applications, you need to put in your effort to make it, like, at the end of it, then end customer experience is like safe, reliable, and bias free.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's this kind of platonic ideal of, if you can make the right thing the easy thing, then you have a much better chance of the right thing happening.
Correct.
That's true, right? So to your point, where it's like, the LLMs are getting better at this, providers are trying to, move up the bar and see kind of how can they raise the tide for all the boats, right? And put in layers that account for harmful or inaccurate content, or gate against potential privacy or security issues.
Correct.
If someone's putting in info into a prompt that doesn't look, looks like personally identifiable information, right? Like, can it recognize automatically that it should not store that, and it should not process that prompt. But to your point, there's more questions probably than and scenarios that need to be built for than could possibly be accounted for horizontally. And so this is where that shared responsibility. So it's I think it's a great kind of way of thinking holistically about the problem, and sort of how that, what needs to be solved in the LLM versus just these layers that will get built up. And some of it comes back to, I think, even some of the same types of platform engineering questions um, that we have in sort of DevOps of like, how do you make this sort of a sustainable, to build kind of reliable, safe, and secured code and production of any kind. How can you raise the tide for all the boats? There's a lot of parallels there. Let's come back to that. Sorry, you had a comment.
No problem. I was just trying to add to a little bit, like if you think like the four layers, if you want to think that, like at the core is the model itself, the foundational model. Then you have the safety system system on top of that, right? Content filtering, rate limits, and throttling, anything like that. Then comes the application. Then comes the positioning, right? The user experience, the application where like you can add more, you can add meta prompts, additional safety mechanisms, and then the user experience is the example I gave, right? You can set right expectations. So if you want to see like it's a four rectangles or four bars of four layers, the bottom two are the foundational model safety system is more of the vendors and platforms responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And then clearly the user experience is the application developer, and application is also the application developer, right? But they can also do a little bit of a safety system they can put in place. They can add more from their vantage point, the more application specific as safety mechanisms. But we can expect to see that the LLM developers and the vendors and the platform providers will augment more and more capabilities, more and more safety systems on in the bottom queue. And then but so that the experience is the developers don't have to do too much, but I don't expect them to see like zero, right? Like it will continue. The developer, application developer, will have to add something, or can expect to add something, even however strong the models will become foundationally. Oh, and then you brought in DevOps process to kind of finish the loop, right? It's more of the identify, measure, mitigate, and operate loop. Like once you identify what the issue is, then you put in, you want to you want to see like what are the systems that you're putting in place, and you want to measure that, and then you continue that. Like it's never going to be like just like one time effort. It's going to be a continuous process, and that's where like the DevOps process that you brought in, or AIOps or MLOps, however you want to call that, will be helpful, so that the model will continue to behave the way it's supposed to, and then in a safe way, continuously.
Right. Yeah, and being prepared for the fact that like, yeah, things will go wrong. There will be something. I've been kind of referring to it as a disturbance in the force. When you've got such a complex architecture and so many places where something can go wrong, and you're talking about those four layers, and there's the model and how it's getting trained and potentially fine-tuned, or where it's too expensive to fine-tune. So you're going to do in-context training, and you're going to do that sort of in parallel to the foundational model, the security layer, the application layer, and then the user experience. I mean, there's, many of these pieces continue to operate and appear normal while something somewhere in the system can break.
It's gonna go back. Yes, absolutely. And then other thing. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean that's what I mean by the kind of disturbance of the force, where it's like, how do you detect that? And it's the appropriate instrumentation, of course, and those extra checks and balances. But it's there's not like one thing that you can just keep your eyes on that glass and know.
Correct. I agree with you on that one. And then also to kind of to reflect that, as you rightly capture, right, 6 weeks since the glucon is like multiple years time frame in terms of what's happening in this space, right? um, we are bound to find more and more possible ways that customers are using, and more and more issues. It's not like one fixed bucket. Right now we're thinking about three large buckets, and then like few subcategories under them. Maybe the buckets will remain the same. Maybe we'll add more possible ways, right? And similarly, like we will continuously improve on how do we mitigate them. So like if you were to talk in 6 weeks from now, we may have found completely something different, or even different possible way of like the ethics or the bias or anything that you want, like respond the reliability and safety, and potentially like we would have a different way of handling that than what we are discussing today. So it's an active space, as an industry, we're getting better at this, and we will continue to get better at this, and we have to keep our eyes and ears open.
Yeah. So if someone were kind of just getting started today, thinking like, hey, this is act 2 of our digital transformation, right? Act 1, we figured out how to adopt kind of an omni-channel experience for our customers and change the way that we build software. Now act 2 is going to be, building on that to introduce, a whole new layer of capability to how we're going to engage with our customers. And obviously, like, the tech companies are on a tear, announcing capabilities, but mainstream insurance companies, consumer facing companies, financial services, right? There's tons of use cases, and anyone in there, right, is starting to take that first step. What's your recommendation? It's having the framework of, okay, this sort of shared responsibility, different layers that you're trying to sort of use to think about and implement an approach for responsible generative AI. What do you recommend as kind of, how do they get started? What would be a good
Starting point
early on? They don't have to have everything solved yet.
Got it. So now, is this like more of an end user recommendation, or is it more of someone is trying to build applications or build something on top of generative AI, or what? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe they're trying to build like a generative AI, maybe just a feature inside something they already have, right? That's the Act 2 part. They've got a sort of digital experience for their customers, and now they want to add in something.
So some of the recommendations here, right? Like, I think let's talk about the who is using it, right? Like, if I'm an end customer, I'm a big bank, or if I'm trying to transform my end user experience using, some of the well-known, some of the easy wins are already in, right? Like, be it generating user documents, or putting in some chatbots, or chat responses. All those things are very easy wins, right? Like, anything that you can do as is, or with less work around, without bringing in your data, right? Like, without bringing in your customer data or your enterprise data, whatever the foundation models can do by themselves, right? Like, the 4 buckets that we talked about, those are easy wins, right? And those wins are, even though like they might look like, hey, it's a simple use case, they provide a lot more value. They can bring in a lot more value right off the bat, right? Be it right, that's something that, pretty straightforward, and people are already using it, right? And then there is this the coding aspect, right? Like, if you are developing applications, or if you are going to build applications on, in general, right? How you are developing, how your coding is already getting revolutionized, right? Like, we saw some stats around, like, how much percentage of GitHub code on GitHub recently is like already AI generated, right? So there is certain things that you need to watch out for, like, how do we get reliable code using Copilot, or right? So that's secondary win, right? And you can apply that to even your productivity layer, right? Like, how do you build your content, how do you build your presentations, how do you build your all those things using leveraging LLM as a Copilot, if you want to call that. How do you do that? So that's like a kind of secondary win, right? But for vast majority of code, whether that's Python or SQL, or those lots of code, like, you're getting reliable, you need to watch out for like, kind of use the pair programming model, right? Like, who's the navigator, who's the driver, to kind of play around between you and AI generated code. Like, you and the AI code generator switch the roles often, but you take the responsibility ultimately. Like, the code generated is your responsibility. Put through all the gauntlet that you would otherwise put it, right? All those things. So that's the secondary level, right? Then third, even now, like, we still are not necessarily bringing in your data, your enterprise data, customer data, if you want to call that. There comes, then that's the third level of thing, that it's going to be a little bit challenging on, like, you need to have make sure that how the data is protected, how you are not giving away your data to the LLM for fine tuning or training or whatnot. So we are getting better in finding the bringing in data patterns, or programming with OpenAI, programming with LLM with bringing custom data. That's kind of one of the design patterns that's evolving, that emerging. Watch out for that. But I think that's where you can get even more value out of these things, right? This is where you can be more accurate, more relevant to your use case, your user base, and whatnot. So that's kind of where I would say three levels. Start with the easy ones, then go for the code, then go with even more with bringing in your data. That's kind of a first three buckets, or first three steps, I would say. And then I will pause here. I want to get to a little bit on um, where you can get the value, how you can get value from LLMs, how do you look around. But any questions on that those points that I made right now on those three layers of getting value or getting returns from foundational models, or getting value out of them?
I think that I think I like that framing with just, dipping the toes in with the kinds of use cases that add value but don't require introducing your own data, customer data. Then kind of thinking about how is
Correct.
this sort of enhancing
Correct.
productivity. I'm just sort
Right.
of pulling it back to make sure I got it all right here. And then finally is, and this is where there's still a lot of emerging work, as you described, these sort of patterns coming around that help you start to include your own data, but in a responsible way, and sort of that being stage three. So I like that framing.
Correct.
I guess even coming back to even just those first use cases, chatbots summarizing. Um, is there anything there that maybe is even like an existing practice, but just like don't forget about this, right? Like we didn't invent it for this, but it's going to be useful here. Or maybe it's something that is new. That's like, hey, just um, uh, what do people need to make sure they don't trip up on step one?
Correct. Got it. So this is I would kind of watch the evolution that we've had since the launch, right, of ChatGPT, right? The first level is there was a lot of talk about being the prompt engineer, right? Like how do you be a bit better prompt engineer? There is still value to it. There's still merit to it. The better the prompts are, the better the outcome is. So that's going to be something that one needs to get better at. One needs to commit trial and error and whatnot. Of course, you see lots of LinkedIn and blog posts on, hey, here are the top 40 prompts you need to know. There are 20 prompts that you didn't know. In my experience, I like to think it's more of get depending on what your use case is, depending on what the context or how much context that you want to provide. Those are helpful. Subtle things that you may want to remember. I think one of the talks that we have had at the Glucon was also LLMs are very good in responding to prompts such as you are a developer, you are a tester, you are an escalation engineer, right? Like the roles or personas that you can define, or it understands better. LLM seems to understand that better, so include them in the prompts, right?
Yeah.
So get better on prompts, but try to give some examples. That's right. And this where also this zero context zero one or multi-context learning comes into the picture, right? You don't have to spend a lot of resource on fine tuning, but you can get a lot more value in context learning. It goes hand in hand with the prompt, right? So this is kind of getting the returns quickly on that. That's those two. But I want to bring the attention back to remember the responsible AI concerns that we talked about to begin with, right? Anything that you generate, don't just take it as is. Have your
Right.
filter on top, be it a content moderator, be it rate, whatever, right? And then other things to put in, make sure that you are uh, rate limiting, for example, so that you are not getting into the cases like the reporter had with Sydney. So those are the things to remember. I think these are very simple but very effective ways to get what you want with very little or no additional the customer data, right? That's to remember, right? So and we are getting better. We will get better and even more get right. But remember, right now the understanding or the thought process that are context learning is more beneficial, more accurate than, or at least like it's much easier way to get to required level of accuracy than trying to retrain the model using fine tuning.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have a few moments, I want to bring to kind of where the opportunity is in this space, right?
Perfect.
Can I, or if you have questions, I'm happy to answer that. But if not, then if you can allow me for like quick 3 minutes deviation, I would appreciate it.
No, this is perfect. Go for it.
Thank you, thank you. So this is like if you're trying to build a startup, or if someone is trying to, hey, where is how do I differentiate? What do I build using generative AI? I like to point them to a model of like a three dimensional axis, right? Think like three F's: foundation, form, and the fit, right? The foundation is where like you make one can think about making different algorithm itself, or make it more explainable. For example, in some predictive LLMs, try to see like the chain of thought and those kind of things will come in picture. This is where like do you want to play with open source, proprietary, and all those things will come to picture. Now, the questions around governance and bias, all those things. This is where the foundation is the place or the axis that you can think about. Um, the other differentiation is like the form factor. Think like LLMs are not new, but the Chat GPT brought in like a huge uh, mind share, right? That's the form factor differentiation, right? Similarly, like Mid Journey or music or anything, that's gonna be that's going to be another other way to look at, right? Like to think like that's the form factor. You are not innovating, or you are not building a new algorithm, but you're just presenting in such a way that uh, the consumer experience is like much better, right? And
Yeah.
that we can say value on that. The third axis is like what I call a fit, right? This is where like your niche, your domain specific, your vertical specific, or even it could be a multi-language, like or different language that we don't have enough confidence right now, right? Like take like Tamil or Sanskrit. LLMs don't do that much of a great job in generating content in that, right? Or it could be AI ops, FinOps, those kind of things. That's kind of foundation, form, and fit. So if you are trying to build business, or even in general, how do you differentiate yourself? Think in those three axes. That's would be my recommendation.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And like, for example, a couple weeks ago, I had a couple members on the PagerDuty team on, from data science and product management and in software engineering. And, one of the things we were talking about was essentially the form angle, right? Which is someone's in the middle of an incident. It's not really the time to be doing a bunch of prompt engineering chain of thought. Like you need a button that does it for you.
Yep.
And all that's been done.
Correct.
And so, that's that example comes to mind as you're breaking that down. Of course, I love things in threes. So 3 axes for whether it's a startup or really just thinking about how you're going to make sure you're solving a unique problem, even with what you're building for your customers. And this probably comes back to a build versus buy type of conversation. If you're at a company and you've got to, you want to take advantage of generative AI, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. All right. Well, I know we're just about at time, so I want to thank you, Sriram, for sharing these insights. I love kind of the frameworks you provide in terms of the different core questions and layers, and even those 3 axes for how to differentiate. So thank you so much. Just a reminder, of course, we'll announce soon our guest for next week, followed by July 24th. We'll have Heath Newburn on talking about AI ops. July 31st, Heather Hinton on the death of the single security pane of glass. So again, thanks everyone for joining today. Thank you, Sriram, for coming on, and have an uneventful day.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dormain. Thank you so much again for the opportunity, and thank you all for tuning in. Have a great rest of the day wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.